Right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of inaugural lectures. As always, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, in particular those from outside the university and indeed those who are family members of our lecturer this evening. So tonight we've got Jill Lancaster, who's going to take us through some of her research, in particular, I think, in relation to some of the global health initiatives that she's been involved with. Jill joined us here in 2016, and before that was actually 9 years as the Director of Postgraduate Statistics, the Statistics Centre at Lancaster University. That was formed as part of a government initiative on Centres of Excellence of Teaching and Learning, so the so-called KETLs. She actually had started her career as a medical statistician in the Christie Hospital, and then she did an MSc in medical statistics at Leicester University. And I suspect we'll get some of the history and her career as we go through. But she went back to full-time education and did a PhD in applied statistics at Lancaster, getting that in 1998, and then moved on to Liverpool to a lectureship in medical statistics, where again she was there for 9 years, and was a deputy director of a research centre there into medical statistics and health evaluation. And that, I think, is the two areas that we're going to hear a lot about. A lot of multidisciplinary research, which again is something that Keele that we are very, very keen on, and relating, for example, studies into the response or the development of children and moving that into a broader global context. There are a number of accolades on this bit of paper that I have in front of me, including the editorship of a new journal, a number of studentships supported, a large number of publications, existence and presence, and enormous contributions to a whole series of national committees. That's all I'm going to say about them. I'm not going to give you a full list because I think the important thing is that we hear from our new professor this evening. So can I introduce our inaugural lecturer this evening, Professor Jill Lancaster. Jill.
So thank you very much. As the VC has said, I'm going to talk to you today about my work in global child health, and particularly about measuring early child development in non-Western settings in developing countries. But along the way, I'm going to mention colleagues and friends that I've had the privilege of working with over the years and who've influenced me in the direction I've taken. So before I start, I'd like to introduce you to the class of 1985, where my early development began, as I completed an MSc in medical statistics at Leicester. So Peter Freeman was a professor of statistics at the time. He's on the right. And if any of you know her, Sally Stenning is in the middle row, third from the left, now professor at the MRC Clinical Trials Unit in London. She was a classmate. And along with Stephanie Hubbard, who's on the front row, second from the right, who didn't know it at the time, but one day she was going to become the director of this MSc program. So I'll leave you to guess which one is me. So this was a significant time for me as I studied medical statistics, meeting friends along the way. And one of these friends was Mary Jones, whom some of you may know, as she worked at Keele as a statistician in maths for quite a lot of many years. And I met Mary when I went to Christie Hospital in Manchester to do my MSc dissertation, then my first job, and we shared an office there whilst Mary was studying for a PhD part-time. And we've been friends ever since. And contributing to the development of future generations of medical statisticians, my niece is now currently taking the same MSc this year with Stephanie as her course director. So about 7 years, after 7 years at the Christie Hospital, I decided to return to full-time education and study for a PhD at Lancaster in the Centre for Applied Statistics. And again, this was a significant time for me in a very friendly and lively centre. And it was here that I began to develop a keen interest in the construction of instruments of measurement in this case deprivation indices and the methods of analysis underpinning these instruments, including item response analysis, under the supervision of Mick Green, who's on the left in the main picture, and also the director of the centre at the time was Richard Davis, who is on the right of the main picture, and behind Mick is Moira Pilo and Brian Francis, whose paths I would cross later on at the PSC. So my roommates were Geeti from Iran and Durley from Brazil and Joy, who's now in America. And at the bottom, on graduation day, I'm with Mick and with Damon Berridge, who's now Professor of Applied Statistics at Swansea. And as I said, the friends we meet along the way become our opportunities of the future. And this year I was invited to teach a stats course with Damon to members of the FAR Institute at Swansea. So moving on from my early development, let's think a little bit more now about early child development and why it's of global interest. So early child development, or ECD as it's called, is often used as an umbrella term that covers anything related to early childhood, including prenatal natal health and development, and physical growth and well-being. So physical growth is often used as a proxy for measurement of overall development, but doing this can miss important aspects of early development. Early child development refers to the changes that take place in the first 5 to 8 years of life. So some time periods are marked by shifts that represent larger developmental changes than in other periods of early life. And the examples seen here are shifts from infancy to preschool, and then shifts from middle childhood to adolescence on the orange line, and other types of development of certain abilities or skills are more continuous on a longer steady developmental trajectory like on the yellow line. So early child development refers to the physical, cognitive, language and socio-emotional development of a child, and this development happens in a variety of settings, in the home, at school, in the community, and involves a wide range of activities, from childcare to nutrition to parental education. So the early child period is considered to be the most important developmental phase throughout the lifespan. And healthy early child development strongly influences well-being, mental health, heart disease, literacy, and numeracy and economic participation throughout life. What happens to the child in the early years is critical for the child's developmental trajectory. So we see in these pictures, social interaction begins early in life with your parent, and then early stimulation is crucial to optimal development. Children develop in their context of their environment, whether it's urban or in a rural environment. And the prevention of malnutrition is crucial to reducing developmental difficulties. And childcare centres and creches must go beyond just physical care to provide the opportunities for early learning. And all this needs trained providers who are able to do comprehensive assessments to monitor these children. So linked to healthy development, there's always known risks to development which may hinder or block progress. And this is a framework proposed by IRTM to conceptualize these risks. So here, developmental risks are presented in order of appearance and significance within the life cycle. There are lifelong risks which can appear at any time of the life course, and these are shown in the centre of the diagram and include physical and mental health problems of the caregivers or child, deficiencies in the psychosocial and educational environment, or exposures to things such as toxins or violence or neglect. There's also age-specific risks which can appear at specific periods of time, so from in preconception or in pre- or perinatal stages, or in infancy, school age, or at adolescence. And we need to keep these things in mind as we move forward and want to monitor change. So, how much do you know about the issues facing the world's most vulnerable children? So I'm going to pose 4 questions that I'm going to pose to you. So what do you think that the answers are? So question 1. How many children are living in extreme poverty in the world today? Question 2. What are half of all deaths of children under 5 attributable to? Question 3. How many children of primary school age are not in primary school? And question 4. What percentage of children leave primary school without learning how to read and write and do simple arithmetic? Well, around 400 million children are still living in extreme poverty in the world today. That's the answer to question 1. Children are more than twice as likely as adults to live in extreme poverty. And still, 15,000 children under the age of 5 are dying every day from poverty-related causes. That's 7,000 within the first 28 days of life. And half of the deaths in children under 5 are attributable to undernutrition. That's the answer to question 2. But the leading cause of malnutrition in children is not lack of food, but diarrheal disease. And we've been making real progress in the world. Since the Millennium Development Goals were set up in 2000, we've now halved the number of under 5 child deaths globally from around 12.6 million in 1990 to 5.6 million in 2016. So more children are surviving, which is good. But despite this, over 250 million children under 5 are still not meeting their developmental potential. Over 61 million primary school-aged children do not attend school, and of those that do, only 38% leave without being able to read and write. The answers to questions 3 and 4. So the economic and social cost to individuals and nations because of this matters, not least in the loss of yearly adult income within countries, which is estimated to be about 20%. Unfortunately, the majority of children at risk live in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And as we can see in this graph of mortality rates for under 5s by WHO region, Africa is still as high as 80 deaths per 1,000 live births compared to Europe, which is as low as 16. And by 2030, it's estimated that 9 out of 10 of the world's children surviving on less than $2 a day will live in sub-Saharan Africa. So education is a powerful driver of development, as the clip that I'm going to show you now illustrates.
We know that education is one of the surest ways to end poverty. In fact, for every year people are educated, their earnings increase by 10%. Educated women are more likely to have educated and healthy children. And educated families weather economic crisis and natural disasters better. The truth is, no country has ever succeeded in the long run without investing in its people. But for many, it isn't as simple as just going to school. Today, 250 million children don't know how to read, even though many have been to school. The good news is, we know what can be done to boost learning. Young children need a head start with good nutrition and stimulation from people around them, so they arrive at school ready to learn. All children need basic math and language skills. Parents and teachers must also help them to think, communicate, create, and connect. Later, technical institutes and universities should equip graduates with knowledge and skills for jobs. And learning must continue through life. Learning for all opens doors to a better life for millions, bringing peace and prosperity to the world. We are the first generation in human history to try to end extreme poverty. Let's begin in school.
Okay, so we see that education is one of the strongest instruments for reducing poverty and improving health. So why is early child development so important? Well, recent advances in neuroscience give us more accurate information about the growth of children's brains. Brain development begins before birth and continues throughout life, but it's the most rapid during the first years of life. During the first few years of life, 700 new neural collections, called synapses, are made every second. And many of them are later pruned based on experience. And those that receive constant stimulation grow in size and strength. And all this is making the brain more efficient. And as this illustration shows, the difference between a newborn and a 2-year-old is much bigger than that between a 2-year-old and an adult. So positive impact as well as negative impact or neglect will have a lasting influence on the architecture of the child's brain in these very early years. So we've seen in the video how today's children will drive growth and development in the societies of tomorrow. And the middle clip here says, we should be deeply concerned that 250 million children, that's 43% of the under fives in low and middle income countries, are at risk of falling short of their potential because of adversities they face in their early formative years. Helping these children will benefit not only them, but all of us. The headline quote from the Lancet last year says, failing to make such investments will have profound implications for children, their families, their societies, exacerbating inequalities and deepening societal divisions. So there's a clear interest in moving this agenda forward by the global and scientific community because 3 Lancet series on child development have been published in recent years. So to move this agenda forward, the United Nations has created a set of 17 goals for countries to aim towards. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as they're called, were set up in 2015 with targets to be achieved by 2030. So the first one, for example, is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The second one is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. The 6th one is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And early child development comes under goal number 4, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So the goals were developed to replace the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. But unlike the MDGs, the SDG framework does not distinguish between developed and developing nations. Instead, the goals apply to all countries. So the 17 broad goals are interrelated, but each has got its own targets to achieve. And there are 169 targets in total, and this slide gives examples of how the targets are all interrelated. We're interested in target 4.2, shown here. But we've already seen that reaching this target will depend on reaching multiple other targets which are known to affect child development. For example, malnutrition caused by diarrhea, or poverty and food insecurity that may cause stunting. Or at the other end of the spectrum, unhealthy food consumption and lack of physical exercise that we see in the Western countries that can cause cancer and diabetes and heart disease later in life. So this is SDG 4, and the target 4.2 says by 2030 to ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care and pre-primary education so that they are ready for primary education. And this will be achieved by monitoring indicator 4.2.1, the proportion of children under 5 years of age who are developmentally on track in health, learning and psychosocial well-being. But what does being developmentally on track mean? Well, early childhood development is multidimensional. It encompasses several aspects of a child's well-being, including, for over 3-year-olds, literacy, numeracy, physical and social-emotional development. And this slide shows available data for 58 countries where at least half of children aged 3 and 4 were developmentally on track in at least 3 of the given domains. But again, we see countries in Africa and Asia performing the worst compared to developed regions such as those in the West. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the lack of trained teachers and poor conditions of schools is particularly hampering achievement of the goal of quality education for all. But how do we know if a child is developmentally on track? The previous UN report does not explicitly say how they measured this. This is an excerpt from a paper by Rakes, and she's highlighting that measurement is an urgent problem. She says to achieve the global target, population-level indicators are urgently needed to assess children's developmental status within and across countries, to evaluate the effectiveness of ECD policies and intervention efforts, and to track progress in meeting global goals and targets. So more accurate measures of early child development are important because of the multiple changes that are occurring in the human brain in the early years of life. We can't just monitor physical growth, for example, although as I've said, this has been used as a proxy measure. So ECG is multi-dimensional. We need to be monitoring vision and hearing and language and speech and fine motor and gross motor skills and socio-emotional skills as well as they develop over time. And this is done well in the West using charts such as this one. So here we see that by 8 months we might expect that a child can roll over both ways for physical and motor skills, that they might be able to initiate facial expressions of others for cognitive and thinking skills. They might be able to exchange sounds or gestures with their parent for language and communication skills, or they might be able to respond to their own name or briefly play alone for social and emotional skills. By between ages 1 and 2, a child is starting to grasp a crane with their hand, put small objects into containers, learning to walk, learning to crawl, learning to run. And by 2 to 3 years, they may be making a tower of several blocks, moving scissors forward on paper, jumping with 2 feet, balancing on 1 foot, or pedaling a tricycle, for example. And to monitor a child's progress, we use child development checklists or instruments, such as this one shown here. This is the early development instrument, and it measures children's school readiness at school entry, so that's between 3.5 and 6.5 years of age, that is completed by kindergarten teachers. It's got 5 major domains of development, which are listed here: physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, language and cognitive development, and communication skills. And it was created by Magdalena Janus and Dan Offord at McMaster University in Canada in 2000, and it's a questionnaire-based checklist of 103 questions, or items as we call them, and it's easy to administer with a yes-no tick box response, as illustrated here. It's intended for large-scale international use as a community tool to monitor children's developmental outcomes at population level, and has been used extensively across Canada and now in over a dozen countries worldwide, such as the US, Australia, Europe, Peru, and Brazil. So we've seen how early child development is measured using instruments that contain indicator items of a child's progress. And we have a few examples shown here, which include recognizing sounds and gestures, pointing to objects or body parts, or waving bye-bye between 9 to 12 months, or starting to complete picture puzzles, for example, at 2 years. But these items are primarily created in Western settings. And this begs the question, what about in non-Western settings? We know that Western tools are used in non-Western settings, but we ask the question, can Western developmental screening tools be modified for better use in non-Western settings? In our case, a rural Malawian setting. So do the indicators and developmental milestones we use apply equally well to these children? They may not have access to picture puzzles or building blocks or knives and forks, for example. And this was a question that we asked in our first piece of work that I'm going to quickly tell you about now. I'm digressing a little and going back in time to the year 2000 to show you how my interest in early child development first began and the techniques that we began to devise and analyse the data. This work came about whilst I was working as a lecturer at Liverpool, and I'd set up a consultancy service at Alder Hey Children's Hospital with help from colleagues in the R&D department, Kath Forrest and Matthew Peake at the top of the slide, around the year 2000-2001. And one day, Melissa came to see me with a large pile of results from work that she'd be carrying out in Malawi as a paediatrician specialising in neurodisability. And this fit very well with my previous work on instrument development, including my PhD. And we've been working together ever since. So I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that were involved in this work, including Professor Ross Smith, who became Melissa's joint PhD supervisor with myself for the second study that we carried out. So the aim of this work was to develop a more culturally acceptable child development assessment tool for use in rural Africa for children aged 0 to 6. It's estimated that some 93 million children worldwide live with a moderate or severe disability. And picking up their disabilities early can help them enormously in their later life. Children often show few signs of developmental delay as infants, and it's not until they start having problems at school that these kind of problems start to be picked up. So we wanted to develop a tool that would identify these children as early as possible, well before school age. So the study was done in two parts. The first part was the preliminary study, which was the data that Melissa brought to the consultancy. And this study was done on the back of the Lungwina Child Survival Cohort Study in 2000-2001. And then we decided to do the study again to form the main part of Melissa's MD. And with the main study was carried out in 2006-2007 in the Blantyre area on the back of the Apple trial. So we went through various stages of work, refining the items, adding items in, taking items out, to eventually produce a 136-item final tool with 34 items in each of 4 domains covering gross motor, fine motor, language, and social skills. And we can see here a sample chart drawn up by a Malawian artist, and there was one for each domain with tick boxes to indicate pass or fail. So, for example, here, for fine motor, we can see children are being asked to grasp hold of an object or build a tower with 4 blocks or to copy drawing a circle, for example. So I just want to stress here that the research team carried out direct assessments on the children. So that's where each child is observed as they do a task, and they're marked as a pass or fail, depending on whether they do that task correctly or not. And it's quite time-consuming and requires trained assessors to do this type of assessment. And each of the assessors has a bag of props to use with the children. Some pilot work and focus group with parents and grandparents, pictured here, and with Malawian health professionals was also done in preparation for carrying out the main study. And as a result, some items were removed or modified or added. And I've already said that Western tools may include tasks and materials that are alien to African children. So the items that we modified, for example, was to use a stick to draw on the ground instead of using a pencil and paper, or to use objects such as a plastic cup, spoon, or plate instead of recognition using pictures, which the children weren't used to looking at. So these are some of the comments from the focus group showing how social skills play an important role in Malawian culture. So social duties and roles and obedience and good behaviour, these are the kind of social skills which are much harder to measure in an instrument. So as a medical statistician, my role in a research project is to help design the study, provide any help as needed, and of course to devise a way of analysing the data. So here we did an item-by-item analysis fitting a model to the data so that we could draw graphs of the probability of a child passing that item by age. So if the model fit the data well, then the ages on the x-axis that corresponded to 25%, 50%, 75% and 90% of the probability of the child passing that item on the x-axis, so we could read off from the y-axis along to the curve and down to the age at which 50% pass, at which 25% pass, and we can get an age for the probability of that percentage of children passing that item. And this was done for all the questions in the 4 domains. And it's a good method for finding the items that didn't work, because it's obvious if an item isn't working. So here, for example, stands holding on. There's lots of dots around the line, and it just wasn't specific enough for the assessors. They didn't know whether the children were standing long enough to pass that item. Mole's ball with clay is another item that was suggested by the focus group, parents and grandparents. And again, this is variable in children passing this item, mainly because some children don't live near a river and therefore can't mould a ball out of clay, we think. Can put clothes on with help. That was obviously wrongly worded, because a child can put clothes on with help when they start off, but as they get older, they don't need help anymore. So it's obvious when you see these curves. and spends most of time on mum's back. Again, that didn't work because a child of 2 or 3 doesn't want to spend their time on their mum's back all the time. So these curves were really useful for seeing the items that didn't work. So as you can see, when we look at all the items together, and this is just for one domain, that there's quite a bit of work involved. So shown here are just the data for 0 to 3-year-olds as an illustration. And looking at the items together, we get a clearer picture of how the probability of a child passing an item changes as age increases. As the children get older, the slopes become less steep, and there's more variability in the age at which an item is passed. So there's more spread in the age that an item is, when 25% are passing the item compared to 90 percentile values. So for the older children, we can see at the bottom of the graph, only a few were passing the items by 3 years because we want to take the items beyond the children's capabilities to allow some of the more advanced children to show their ability. And once all the items have been analysed, we held a consensus meeting with experts to finalise the items for the tool and drew up these charts showing the ages at which they're boxes, and each box represents the age at which 25% are passing, 50% are passing, 75% are passing, and 90% of the children pass each milestone in our normal sample of children, which could then be used to assess future children against a normal standard. And you can see what happened if we'd have just stopped at the preliminary study. These curves, this is an example of curves which don't look as nice. You can see we had quite a few gaps in this one for language development, and the social domain only had around half of the items were reliable enough to use. So that's why we went back and did the study again. So we used a simple scoring technique where you just draw a red line at the child's age and then assess them starting about 7 items to the left of the line. And if a child fails the domain, they fail the domain if they failed 2 or more items before the red line. So if there's crosses, then we would say that the child had failed that domain. If they're developmentally on track, then there's lots of ticks, as you see on the left-hand graph. So this was a very simple way of scoring the children. So the MDAX slides have illustrated what I do as a medical statistician, and this slide shows how the work can generate new projects for statistical PhD students. And Philip, one of my PhD students, shown in the picture above with Andrew, his joint supervisor, did some work on improving our simple pass-fail scoring methods by implementing other methods, including the Z-score technique shown here. So here on the left, we see the strong relationship between simple additive average scores and age, because obviously the older the child, the more items they will pass, and so the higher their score will be. But we developed a range of normal value charts, basically means and standard deviations, for 33 age groups that researchers could use to calculate a standardized score. So that's basically taking the score, subtracting the mean for that group, and dividing by the standard deviation. And so then we could compare the scores of children of different ages on one standard scale. The standard scale had a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So the right-hand graph here shows how the effect of age has now been taken out, as the scores are all nicely scattered around 0, the mean of the standardized scale. And this also shows how well the MDAT performs in separating different groups of children. So the normal children are the black dots, and that's what we used for our standard measures. But we also here have got a group of disabled children. They're the red dots, and you can see that they're all got lower Z scores. And in the middle are a group of malnourished children, and they lie around in the middle. So this is a good way of taking out the effect of age in order to be able to compare children like for like at different ages. And Philip did some other things using item response analysis to get similar results. So this map shows the research projects that are currently being carried out in 10 countries in Africa, currently using the MDAT, and they're being used here as outcome measures in international intervention programs designed to improve child development. So it's good that people are using the tool. And we've published this work in 2010. So that was a quick diversion, and I want now to return to Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and to the present work that I'm doing. So the MDAT work led us to become involved with the World Health Organization, the WHO, to develop a new tool for 0 to 3 years for population-level monitoring. We were invited in 2013-14 to join a WHO working group to develop the tool, which we've called the WHO Indicators of Infant and Young Child Development, the IYCD, which I'll come to shortly. But we need to first of all understand that there are many interconnected agencies working towards the 2030 target of the SDGs, including UNICEF, the World Bank, and the WHO. And the UN set up a number of independent expert advisory groups, and one was responsible for developing the global indicator framework for SDG reporting, and another was set up to make recommendations on bringing about a data revolution in sustainable development. So as the quote here says, "Data do not of themselves change the world. They make change possible by identifying needs, supporting advocacy, and gauging progress." And one of the key aspects of global measurement was that many of the indicators drawn up for the SDGs could not currently be compared because they lacked the measurement tools to do so, leaving governments without the knowledge they need to accurately track progress towards achieving the goals. And this is why the WHO project was launched. So the key message of these advisory groups is that SDG monitoring will require innovation and integration of data from a range of different sources to complement and verify country official statistics. And this quote from Margaret Chan, former Director General of the WHO, underpins the next body of work that I'm going to talk about. She says, as WHO, we intend to work with member states and partners to ensure that every child has the best possible opportunity to realise its full developmental potential. And we know that many more children are now surviving, but we want them to also thrive for the many reasons that I've already outlined. So the reason we have to ensure that child development stays on track, on a healthy track, is because we now know much more about the consequences of children being off course, including the likelihood of poor health and low educational attainment. So in order to be able to monitor progress towards the SDG targets, we want a population-based measure, but what does this mean? If we had all the money in the world, we would monitor every child and carry out individual evaluations with high-level precision tools on multiple aspects of development. But we can't do this at the population level, so we have to settle for instruments with lower precision, producing one overall metric that are good enough to do the job. And this will allow us to identify vulnerable and successful regions, to monitor the impact of emergencies on early child development, to monitor change over time, and to differentiate off and on track for population or regional reporting. At the population level, we can't really do direct assessments of children as it will be too costly. So instead, we want to be able to ask caregivers quickly about what their child can do. Sometimes we may need a few directly observed items if necessary, but really we want a caregiver report. So we need a tool that is reliable in terms of consistency of measurement, is valid in terms of measuring what it's supposed to be measuring, is culturally neutral, so the same items apply across populations and cultures. It gives results or scores that can be easily interpreted by policymakers and program managers, and it's open access and freely available for people to use. So it's against this backdrop of interagency activity that the next piece of work came about, due to the lack of available culture-neutral, caregiver-reported measurement tools for use in this context. And as you can see, we're quite an international team from 8 different universities, and this is our work started with the core team, seen here, and later 3 country teams joined us. So we have Taryn in the blue jacket on the left and Vanessa on the right, who are from WHO. Taryn, they're both experts in neurodisability, and Taryn oversees the project and the funding, and Vanessa keeps us all organised. And Gareth and I, shown on the left, are the statisticians, and Tricia, who's from UCLA Berkeley, and Magdalena Janice from McMaster's, and Melissa from Liverpool are the child development experts in our group. So these are the stages of work that have been carried out. So stage 1 was completed by a team at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It was basically a literature review to create a conceptual framework of developmental milestones for different age groups. And I'm mainly going to talk about stage 2 and stage 3. So at the end of stage 1, I'll just quickly show you the conceptual framework, what it looked like. It basically looked like this. There was different developmental domains and the kind of items that you might be expecting the child to be able to pass at different age groups. So stage 2 was the creation of our prototype tool version 1. So what we wanted to do was collect existing cross-sectional data from studies carried out in low and middle income countries on children under 3 years of age. And that had to include that developmental assessment measures were made on these children. We wanted to gain consensus as to which items in the tools could be used in these settings and in order to create our first version of the tool. And note that in this work we're interested in children aged 0 to 3, and another group led by UNICEF is focusing on older children up to 8 years of age. So we analysed data on 21,000 children from 10 countries shown in this map across 3 continents, amounting to 14 contributed data sets and 7 instruments that we were given from existing data, from researchers with existing data. And this table shows the tools that were analysed and the countries and the age ranges that we received data for. So the candidate data sets were included if they met certain criteria. They had to include over 300 assessed children aged 0 to 3. They had to employ tools developed or used at least in one low or middle income country. They had to contain demographic, contextual background information as well on the children that were sampled. And they had to report good reliability and validity for the country sites used. So the data were given to us anonymised, and investigators signed a data sharing agreement. So the first thing that we did was to conduct a matching exercise of items within tools to identify similar items. So in total, there were 789 items across the 7 tools, and we created a 789 by 789 matrix in Excel. And then the 3 subject matter specialists went through all the items and compared them with each tool and put a cross in the cell if they judged the item to be the same or similar. And we can see quite a bit of heterogeneity between the experts in what they considered to be a match, ranging from 278 matches to 598 matches for expert 3. So using a selection criteria of a match from 2 out of 3 of the assessors, the experts, we had a total of 136 item groups comprising 344 items that were selected. And these went forward to be discussed in a consensus meeting. And a bit further down the line, we did a second match because there were some gaps in the age ranges that we were looking at. And we did the same thing again to fill in some of the gaps. So we used a similar technique of producing curves to aid our decision-making about item performance that we had for the MDAT. This time we had curves for each item group, which included country and the tool used on the same plot. So the top left item is a good example of an item that can be used across countries. It's universal. The behaviour manifests itself at roughly the same time in different countries around the world. And when asked in a slightly different way from a different tool, it discriminates between older and younger children. It's got a nice steep slope. The bottom left item is also universal, but it does not discriminate for our age group because the item is too difficult for the children. Most of them can't do it. The top right is non-universal. It does discriminate, but the behaviour manifests itself at different times because there's a shift between different countries and when asked in slightly different ways. Now, many of these items were included in our tool, and we then tended to base the item on tools sitting in the middle of the range if the curve looked okay. And the bottom item is non-universal. It doesn't discriminate, maybe because the wording's not good enough. Something's wrong with that item. So we had the first mapping exercise, after the first mapping exercise, we held a consensus workshop in Geneva of experts, and some of them had contributed the data sets. And the 129 item groups were reviewed, and each graph was discussed to reach consensus on inclusion of the item or exclusion of the item, irrespective of choice of wording. So each participant was given a booklet of graphs to assess, and the expert participants identified 70 candidate item groups for inclusion in our tool. A few specific items were considered important milestones by the experts at the consensus meeting, and so sometimes they were included as long as they performed well in at least 2 countries. So we created a simple prototype tool of 120 items, 23 fine motor, 23 gross motor, 20 receptive language, and 24 expressive language, and 30 socio-emotional. So we didn't have a separate cognitive module, but various items in the fine motor and language subscales had cognitive aspects. So this graph shows a visual representation. We wanted to do a bit of validity at the end of this part of the work. It shows a visual representation of the linking of the data sets onto a single common scale through item response modelling process, a statistical modelling process. And the graph displays a curvilinear relationship between development and age, with more rapid development occurring in the first year of life, and then a slowing down in the subsequent years. So the graph illustrates the excellent coverage across the age spectrum from all the contributed data sets, as well as the consistency of measurement between all these different tools. And Gareth worked very hard to produce this plot, and I was extremely pleased with it. It's what we think is a novel finding, and we've not seen it before as far as we're aware. It's not been done before. So we're very proud of this plot, so I'll just leave it up for a little while. So we then went on, we've got our first prototype of the tool. We then went on we wanted to pilot test it in the field. So before we could go and do that, we had to do some feasibility work and some preparatory work. So first of all, we recruited 3 country teams. We recruited Claudia from Brazil, and Manira from Pakistan, and Limbika from Malawi. And they were recruited for the pilot sites. And the project was approved by their ethics committees and the WHO Ethics Committee. There are various, so one site in each of the countries was chosen for the pilot, for feasibility work. So we created detailed standard operating procedures so that each site knew exactly what to do, and we did it in consultation with the country teams. We had detailed implementation protocols for adaptation and testing. The tool had to go through a process of translation and back translation by the country teams. And we also wanted to collect anthropometric, family care, and socioeconomic contextual data, so we had quite a lot of SOPs. So one thing we wanted to do in this particular phase of the study was that many of the items and skills deemed important from the tools and which showed acceptable developmental progress across instruments had been administered originally on tools that were through direct assessment. So we needed to look at the feasibility of reframing these items into caregiver-reported items, and that was an important thing we had to do to assess the feasibility of doing this before we went out and did the pilot work properly. So here we see Claudia doing a caregiver report with parents, and Claudia also doing a direct assessment with a child. So again, we used the similar types of curves to assess the performance of the items for caregiver versus direct assessment. We wanted the items tested by the 2 methods of assessment to perform similarly across countries and be able to distinguish between older and younger children. So this is a good example where both types of assessment are producing very similar empirical curves for each country. Pakistan is in the green, Brazil is blue, and Malawi is pink. And the caregiver reports are the solid lines, and the direct assessments are the dotted lines. So remember, this is only a feasibility study, and the curves look quite crude because here we only had around 30 measurements from each country. So we didn't want to do anything more sophisticated like fitting models to the data. This is another example where here we can see that the caregivers are reporting that the children can pass the item at a slightly earlier age than the direct assessment is showing. So we did a lot of these curves to have a look at how these items were performing, and sometimes we had to modify the different wordings. We also obtained feedback from the countries on the processes and the training and the SOPs and the documentation. And one thing that the country teams mentioned to us was that we should include examples of play for boys. They thought that most of our examples are toys and games that girls play. So we rephrased one of the items into, does your child ever try to imitate your actions around the house? Also, mothers didn't recognise some of the sounds we were asking them to identify in their children, such as grunts and groans and throaty sounds when they were translated into the country language. So we added audio examples to the tablets for data collection. So at the end of this phase, we basically had added audio-visual examples to the tablet, modified items, and we also found that for socio-emotional items, caregivers were having trouble saying yes or no as to whether a child could do something. So we modified the socio-emotional items to have a 3-category response of never or almost never, sometimes, and always, almost always. So then we went on, we got our pilot work done. So then we went on out into the field to do the pilot testing. Once we were ready, with the second version of the tool, we drew up a table to quota sample children from rural urban areas by sex and age, and we wanted the data to be collected on 96 children from each country. So the purpose of the pilot testing was to finalise electronic data capture and trial the tablets for data collecting, to try out how to sample the children. Mostly they were from health clinics within each country. We wanted to try out all the items as caregiver-only report, and we wanted to do some cognitive testing and reliability testing and some analyses with the contextual background information. So a new booklet of graphs was produced for discussion, and this time they were more detailed to enable adequate assessment of each item and included agreement statistics on the reliability of measurement. So again, we fit models and produced curves, both with just age in the model, like the graph on the left, and also including a range of demographic variables seen on the right. And we might have expected the curves to come closer together on the right-hand side after accounting for the demographic information in the model, and they do a little bit. So we then reviewed all the information to decide on the final set of items. Items were removed for a number of reasons. They were either too difficult for 3-year-olds, up to 3-year-olds. They weren't related to age, so the curves were too flat. There was a poor comparison between countries. We also took note of the cognitive testing feedback. And sometimes we had similar items overlapping for age of attainment, so we didn't need to include them all, so we took some of them out. And these are our final MDAT-style graphs for our final 3 areas of development. So we combined fine and gross motor skills into just motor skills. We combined receptive and expressive language and cognitive skills into language and cognitive. And we had our socio-emotional development. Now, the socio-emotional items are always the most difficult, and we chose 20 of the ones that showed some developmental increase and pattern. So note that this is a caregiver report and not a directly assessed report like the MDAT, so there's a little more variability in the age at which certain percentages of children are passing the items. And our final tool had 90 items, 40 motor, 30 language, and 20 socio-emotional items, and then an additional 10 from the socio-emotional items that we call general behaviour because they could be asked at any age, giving a total of 100 items in the IYCD tool. So this is just an example of mainly the socio-emotional items at the bottom having this 3-category response and the other domains having a yes-no response. So we developed a preliminary scoring mechanism based on the results of the pilot study. The scoring mechanism takes the sum of the score of the participant and their age into account and produces a development for age DAS score. And we're calling this preliminary because it's based only on the results of 269 children in 3 countries. But as we gather more data from the countries using the tool, then we'll be able to refine this further. So nevertheless, at this stage, the scoring mechanism is working very well. We see discrimination in the distribution of scores by country, which makes sense. with Brazil slightly ahead in terms of child development, as we might expect, because it's stronger, more economically stronger. The children in Pakistan were sampled from more rural and poorer areas, and on the whole they were developing slightly behind Brazil, and Malawi fell in the middle, and the children there were sampled from around Blantyre, a large city. So in order to calculate these DAS scores in the field, a spreadsheet's been created. Gareth created a spreadsheet, and it's available from download from the web platform. So we also produced percentile plots with lines showing the development of children for different percentile values, the black line showing the 50th percentile, or the average development overall. And again, we can see individual children from Brazil, the blue dots along the top of the line, indicating that Brazil is slightly ahead overall in terms of their development. And these percentile plots compared very well with other anthropometric measures that are used to monitor children. We can see that the IYCD is doing better, or at least as well as other measures indicating developmental delay or progress, such as head circumference or weight for age. So this is what the paper version of the IYCD looks like. We added a don't know option if caregivers were unsure of their response. The items are administered to the caregivers, are dictated by the age of the child. Only a range of items are asked to the caregiver, so they don't have to answer all 100 items. This is an example of the tablet version, how we collected the data in the field. Some items have got pictures, videos or audio support. The pictures and videos included in the instrument were taken in a wide range of settings and are included in a separate document on the web platform for the paper version. And as you've seen on the tablet, pictures appear on the tablet showing pictures as necessary. This is an example of the noises that caregivers couldn't understand when it was translated into words. So we also have audio examples. So that the caregivers can be shown those to show what kind of noises we want their child to be making. And the training manuals the training materials are all available on our new website, and the IYCD is open access, culture neutral caregiver report for researchers and countries to use. So the purpose of the instrument is to enable tracking of child development at population or group level. It's not intended to be a screening tool or a diagnostic test. So a tool such as the MDAT would be better suited in this respect. This is just to acknowledge everybody and say thank you to the people that took part. So during the development of the IYCD, we discovered that 2 other teams were also creating similar measures to ours. And earlier this year, we all met in London to discuss what we had been up to and what we'd been doing to see if we could harmonise our work to develop one measure for monitoring purposes. And this is what we are now doing, and I travel to a meeting in Seattle at the Gates Foundation tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. So I've got to get up early. So some preliminary work have been done. We've carried out a little bit of work to compare the tools, and there does seem to be very good concordance between these 3 tools, and so we're going to discuss this further over the next few days. So these are all the people that are going to be involved. Basically, we're going to see the funders in Seattle to see if we can get this project funded. So another new development that's also happening is coming from UNICEF. In 2016, the 6th round of their multiple indicator cluster surveys, MIC6, was launched to align with these SDGs, and in doing so included some of our MDAT and IYCD items in a new set of indicators, and they're currently testing. And members of our group were invited to attend a recent consultation in New York about the work so far, and I attended remotely. So there's now a lot of activity going on and an awareness that we need to find ways of working together in this area. So what I've talked about today is only one thread of the work that I do, and I've shown how one opportunity can lead to another over the span of a career. But as a medical statistician, we don't focus on just one topic area, but in general, we're working on a number of projects in very different subject areas at the same time, which can be very challenging. So I could equally well have told you about other tools that I've been working on with others to create, for example, the Adolescent Diabetes Needs Assessment Tool with Helen Cooper and Joy and the team in Liverpool. I could have also told you about the challenges of living with cystic fibrosis, the CLCF tool, with Kevin Southern and Holly and Claire and Gareth from Liverpool, again, from Alder Hey Children's Hospital. Another important thread of work stems from a fairly insignificant paper that we published in 2004 to try and improve the way people were using pilot studies inappropriately as smaller versions of the main trial, and it's now my most cited paper ever, over 800 citations at the last count. But this little paper led to working with colleagues, shown here at the bottom of the screen, to develop consort extension guidelines for pilot trials, and ultimately to my being asked to be editor-in-chief of a new journal resulting from our work called Pilot and Feasibility Studies. And we as a team are continuing to work together, led by Sandra Eldridge, and we're currently seeking new funding. And that again is another story to tell. So I would just like to thank each of my colleagues for the rewarding and interesting journeys that we've taken together. As the VC mentioned, in 2007, I found myself later back at Lancaster as director of the PSC, working with Brian Francis again and administrators Deborah and Angela at the top, who I always want to give a big hug to because they've been so helpful in the past. And my job during this period was very much on innovation in teaching and learning at postgraduate level in statistics. And the new centre building was opened by Professor Sir David Cox at the top of the screen, and we were very proud of that. And here are some of the teaching publications that we published. So Svetlana and Andrew were RAs at the time, and they did various teaching projects, and we set up a PhD partnering scheme in Brazil with Durley, from one of my former office mates from Lancaster when I was doing my PhD. And they're seen at the bottom of the picture. So Durley's on the left with Rodrigo from Brazil, and the 3 PhD students are on the right, Abby, Laura, and Becky, with Andrew and Gillian jointly supervising them. So again, a big thank you to all involved in this work. And mentoring young people has always been a rewarding part of my work as an academic statistician, to see them develop and become researchers in their own right. So shown here are most of the young people I've mentored as students or young researchers, or those that I could find a photograph for. And I hope that they've enjoyed their journeys as much as I've enjoyed taking the journey with them. And I'd just like to thank them for all their dedicated hard work on various projects that we've done together. And there are significant achievements here too that I could tell you about if I had time. And a special thanks to the friends and colleagues who have kept me sane over the years, the colleagues who have been a great support to me, always ready for a chat, and I'm so grateful to them for their kindness. So we have Tanya, who I met in Manchester at Christie Hospital, Marta from Liverpool, Moira from Lancaster, and Susan from my church at home. And a big thank you too to my sister Janet, who's Professor of Cancer Clinical Trials at Warwick. She's a great support and a friend to me, with a little sibling rivalry thrown in to keep me focused. And last but not least, my husband Robin, who's my rock and keeps me fed when I forget to eat, which is quite often if I'm working. And when I asked him which photo I should show, he immediately suggested this one, which is at the end of our coast-to-coast cycle ride of the Way of the Roses, which we did in 3 days, which he thinks is my greatest achievement ever. So finally, I would just like to end on a personal note with the children that we've sponsored over the last 25 years through the work of compassion, trying to make a small difference in the world for a few children. So I look forward to the future and to making new friends at Keele. And I thank Christina, my PA, for all her hard work in organising things behind the scenes today. And I thank you all for listening. Thank you.